All right, looks like we're on. Hello, everyone. Welcome to MileHiCon 52 Virtual Edition. We are here for cool podcasts you might love. Um, and I am CJ Ward. I'm your moderator. Let's introduce the panelists. And since we can't just go down the table like we normally would, let's go alphabetical by first name. So start with Cory.
Hi, I'm Cory Doctorow, and I am a novelist and an activist and a technologist. My most recent book is this one here, Attack Surface, the Third Little Brother book. And I've had a podcast, I was just thinking, I think since 2005. And I was there when my friend Ben coined the term podcast. And I listened to a lot of podcasts. I literally just hit mute on one as I sat down to do this event.
All right, and Patrick.
That's awesome. You were right there with Murr.
Yeah.
My name is Patrick Hester. I am a two-time Hugo Award winner, one for podcasting with the SF Signal podcast. I am a writer, and my latest book is over here in the corner. You probably can't quite see it, but it's right there. And I am also the host and producer of the Functional Nerds podcast. We've been around for 10 years, a little over 10 years now. And the first 10 years was with John Anelio, who was a musician and a sci-fi geek. And now I am partnered with Tracy Townsend, the author of The Fall and The Nine, and we're continuing on with the podcast. And I've been to MileHiCon a bunch of times and I love it, and I'm glad to be here.
Okay, thank you. And Wendy. Oh, sorry. Good timing on my part
Just
there,
as
huh?
I was taking a drink of water. Sorry about that. I'm Wendy Van Camp. I'm an author, a poet, an illustrator, and a podcaster. My latest book is this one right here. It's The Planets. It's a sci-fi coup poetry collection, and it was nominated for an Elgin Award this year. My website is No Wasted Ink. It is a site for science fiction and fantasy readers and writers. I interview up-and-coming authors. I have a great top 10 article list that's very popular. I review classic science fiction books and a bunch of other stuff I'm just not going to go into. My podcast, I'm a semi-regular on the Science Fiction Roundtable podcast. It's been around for a year or two. I just got started with it last April. I've done about 13, 14 episodes. And I'm very happy to be there. I'm hoping to do more in later years. And of course, as most authors and poets do, I bounce around doing a lot of guest posts on other podcasts. So I'm looking forward to this panel. It should be a lot of fun.
All right, glad to have you here. We've got one more panelist scheduled. If they show up, we'll pop them in and introduce them then. But until then, let's just get started. It's called Cool Podcasts You Might Love. It could just be a list of things you love, but let's talk a little more in depth about what grabs you when you're looking for a new podcast. I'll just open it up to anyone who wants to jump in.
Well,
I guess.
I'm sorry, you go ahead.
No. It's all right. Go ahead, Cory.
I was going to say that, although I confess that I am, like everyone, very interested in kind of long form, well-produced, high-budget podcasts and series, for me, it's the homespun nature of them that makes them exciting. It's like the early days of blogs, like zines. It's the low-cost format that allows people to find narrow niches and fill them in a way that is extremely personal. The thing that I find to kind of answer the anti-version of your question, the thing that I find most often purging from my podcast is the kind of hypertrophied version of that, where you have some people who are very interesting people, but their podcast becomes a weekly or even bi-weekly 2 to 3 hour panel discussion. And I just find that as interesting as I may find those people, 6 hours a week is too much. It's in a zero-sum budget. I just miss other stuff. I don't know how anyone follows Joe Rogan, whatever you feel about his work and his politics. I think that's a 15-hour a week commitment. I don't know who has 15 extra hours in their week. And it really feels like he's got a bit of a flood the zone strategy there.
And I think, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No,
I forgot.
I'm sorry.
I forgot.
I'm sorry. It's the Zoom. We don't know
It
who's going
is.
to go, whatever.
It is, yeah.
I apologize. But I just wanted to bring up, when I look at podcasts, I don't call myself a heavy listener of podcasts, just because, as Cory mentioned, we only have so many hours in the day, and I got to get a little writing in occasionally, right? But I like well-produced short podcasts. I tend to look for ones that are no more than a half hour in length, and maybe come out once a month or bi-weekly, a little less often. So it's easier for me to follow through. Although I will say my favorite musical podcast comes out, it's a full hour, and it comes out a little more often, but because I walk my dog with it, or at least I used to before my dog passed, unfortunately. But I used to use that as my dog walking podcast. And it was the perfect length, because to go around my local lake was 45 to 50 minutes, and the podcast was about an hour. Worked great. But other than that, I like to keep things very short and informational. I like to make sure when I listen to a podcast, it's going to be worth some of my time to do so. Not that, fun stuff isn't worth it too, but that's kind of what I look for in a podcast.
I'm very similar to the comments that both of you have made. And a lot of times it depends on my mood and what I'm specifically kind of looking for. If I want something that's the business of writing as a writer, that's a completely different set of things that I'm looking for versus if I want, fiction, just straight up fiction. I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I will say I am, if the audio isn't good, you've lost me big time. So there's tons of podcasts out there. If I'm start to listen to one and suddenly there's dogs barking and kids screaming and cars racing by because they've got the window open and there's all these distractions, that's it. I don't listen anymore. It's too distracting. So, and that might come from, just doing my own podcast and having people go, oh my God, at minute 14 and 37 seconds, there was a thump. How could you possibly do that to me? So I've kind of become probably hyper aware of background noises, and I try to edit them out of my stuff. And so I expect other people to do the same thing, which might be a little bit snooty on my part. I don't know.
What is a podcast you'd recommend if someone had never listened to the format before, which I think is getting more and more rare these days, but just to get someone started on podcasts?
I definitely think you need to go short. So I believe that Wendy was talking about shorter podcasts. Start short, start small, start quick.
I think I'd like to just recommend one. One of the ones that I listen to because I'm a writer is Escape Pod. It's a science fiction short story anthology, and I find it excellent. It's great to relax to. It's one of the first podcasts that I kind of regularly tuned into, in addition to my one music one that I liked. But you really need to kind of look for podcasts that fit your particular interests. For instance, since I'm a writer, I like to look for podcasts with writing tips. One of my favorites is Writing Excuses. It's short. It's about 15 to 20 minutes long, very professionally produced, and very entertaining. In fact, I think, Cory, you were just a guest there recently, weren't you?
It's true. Yeah, I recorded that last year in the Great Before. But they in fact, I think we did 3 episodes, and they held one in abeyance to coincide with the launch of the book. I'd actually forgotten that was coming out. So it's quite a lovely surprise when it did.
I think it depends on what you're looking for too. If you're looking for fiction, any of the escape artist podcasts would be great, and they've got different ones. So Pseudopod is horror, Escape Pod is science fiction, Podcastle is fantasy, and then their YA. What's the YA? Is it Cast of Wonders? I think is the name of the YA.
So.
am quite loyal to people who are my friends. And so I produced I Should Be Writing for several years for Murr, including a little segment that she used to do with this guy named Matt Wallace, and it was called Good Cop, Bad Cop. And they spun that out into a great writing. You know, if you're interested in the business of writing, it's a great podcast. It's called Ditch Diggers.
I've been going through my list of podcasts here. If you see me looking at my phone, that's what I'm doing. And I think I have two recommendations that might not be on the immediate radar of people who go to cons. The first is a piece of like crazy utopian leftist political speculation called Seriously Wrong, SRSLY Wrong. And it's two people in British Columbia and Canada who do, it's a long form show. Having just said I don't like long form shows, it's a long form show, thankfully not all that regular, that runs to a couple of hours. And each week they tackle a kind of utopian political idea, often related to labor politics or the environment. And they interleave sketches and comedy bits with thought experiments, like design fiction, things like ads from the future, and then sometimes guests. I was just a guest on it. They coined a term that has been really influential in my own work, library socialism, which I called the vision of circulating abundance. And it actually turned out to be the crux of the novel I'm working on. So it was a very productive one for me to look at. Another one that I'll recommend that's in that same vein is Flash Forward by Rose Eveleth, who's a alumnus of Radiolab. And Rose is a technologist and science writer who, again, it's a very similar format, much shorter, I think about 30 minutes. Each episode opens with a sketch from the future, and then a deep dive into the socio-technology of some idea. This week, it was about the future of employment and automation, and then Back to the Future. And so it's this kind of, it's a sandwich of like dramatic sketches with some stuff in the middle, including a lot of guest interviews. And then the last one I want to recommend here is called More Perfect. And it was a limited run podcast that I think is concluded, sadly, but it was an absolutely genius idea from Radiolab, from Jada Boomrad from Radiolab. And he realized that there was this thing called the Oye Project that was putting all of the known audio of every Supreme Court case into a public repository. And he realized that this meant that these really gnarly stories that wend their way to the Supreme Court would have all this audio that you couldn't otherwise use. You know, that you know, when you're trying to tell legal stories, especially from the past, you're often hamstrung by the lack of good audio for good audio storytelling. And if you don't know Radiolab, they're this, you know, avant-garde, amazing public radio show that became one of the great early podcast successes. And he takes all of that amazing editorial stuff that he does so brilliantly and turns it into these deep dive storytelling exercises that explicate and illuminate turning points in American law and thus society, culture, industry, war. They are really, really good. Just the one, he just replayed the one about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's early history campaigning for gender equality and the incredible legal maneuver she went through, where she found cases where men were being discriminated against and brought those cases before the court because she correctly reasoned that that would result in a more favorable precedent that she could then leverage in instances where women were being discriminated against. They're so beautifully done, and the audio is amazing. So those are my three recommendations. Seriously Wrong. God, I always forget the name of Rose's podcast. Flash Forward and More Perfect.
Thank you. So we talked about like going for things for length and audio production. Is there a genre that you prefer to, or do you like a little bit of everything?
I guess I can go on that one. I actually do have particular genres that I look at. The first ones that I used to look for were writing tips. So the writing excuses. I think you mentioned Mere Lafferty's. You must be writing or whatever. I love that one. I'm sorry. Yeah. I should be writing. That's it. Love that one. That was one of the podcasts that really caught my attention when I was first getting into podcasts. So, and I think she's here at the con this
She
year.
is,
come to think
yeah.
of it,
I'm
too.
I'm kind of
Yeah,
bummed
yeah.
because I was looking forward to hanging out with her when she got here to Denver, and that didn't happen. So, but
Yeah, these things
my
happen.
former co-host on Functional Nerds actually wrote the theme music for I Should Be Writing. So anytime you hear
Oh,
that
how cool.
song, that's him. I got
My
tired of
claim to
listening to
fame-
that.
My claim to fame here is Mur is a former student of mine, so I'm
Nice.
gonna
Wow.
claim on that. That's my sneaking my nose under the tent here on Mur.
I guess we're all secret fans of Murr. That's great.
I'm a not so secret fan.
Yeah,
It
no,
is
I'm not
evident
secret
at
either.
this point.
But anyway, Writing Tips was the first kind of general genre. And I really only got one or two music programs. I think that's one that many people look into. But for me, I just had the one that I like to walk my dog to. And that was the Irish and Celtic Music Podcast. It's features live, well, not really live, but Irish folk music. Back in the day, during my artist period, I worked at a lot of Ren fairs and Highland Games, partly Scottish in descent. And so this music helped me kind of tap into my cultural roots. And it was not something that I could hear readily on the radio here in Los Angeles. So I really got into the podcast. It's still going strong. I think it has like 400 or 500 episodes now. And I do, if you like Celtic music, I do recommend it. And then finally, the biggest genre or type of podcast I look for these days is ambient music, believe it or not. I'm finding that I like to have an ambient soundtrack running in my headphones while I'm writing. And so I look for very long tracks, maybe 6-7 hours in length. I look for things like rainstorms, coffee house noises, that kind of thing, or sometimes just instrumental music that I can play very low in the background. And I find that it helps my workflow. And happily, I find them for free on YouTube quite often. So I can just pop YouTube onto my phone, turn off the screen, put on my little headphones, and boom, on my laptop, and I'm busy. And currently, that's kind of my biggest thing I'm looking for, believe it or not, are ambient tracks, especially with NaNoWriMo coming up next month. So I'm getting my soundtracks all prepared right now. So it's amazing to me what you can find. I mean, literally any topic under the sun is available. It's looking within yourself and deciding what you like and what kind of things are of value to you that you need to be focusing on, I think, when it comes to podcasting.
You know, I think one of the smartest books ever written about the internet was a book by David Weinberger called Everything is Miscellaneous. It's kind of old school internet theory stuff. And, you know, David's point was that in the physical world, the categories are a kind of necessity because you can only shelve a book in one place, and you have to decide which university you're going to go to and which program you're going to enroll in and so on. And categories are super fuzzy, right? And all the interesting stuff happens at their boundaries, right? You know, like gender has a largely bimodal distribution, but all the cool stuff is going on at the edges that aren't in those big two peaks, right? And you know, things that we call species actually turn out to often be able to create viable, fertile offspring with things that are formally members of other species. All the groovy stuff happens kind of where the exceptions arise. And for me, that like the wonder and terror of aggregation technologies. So RSS is the big one, and RSS is the underlying technology that lets podcasting happen. Is that it creates this kind of incoherent higgledy-piggledy in which, you know, in my podcatcher, as I look at it here, I have a bunch of political podcasts, a bunch of technical podcasts, a bunch of auctorial podcasts, podcasts about economics, podcasts about comedy, you know, podcasts from the UK, podcasts from the US, podcasts from Canada, podcasts about sex, podcasts about the future, and it's just all like in this giant bucket, right? Without the pretense that these are somehow separable. And, you know, for me, it's like, the other thing that RSS gets you, and again, that's the underlying technology in podcasts, is both a mechanism for following the things that are of high frequency, but also especially a way to follow the things that are of low frequency. Like some of my favorite podcast feeds are feeds that one MP3 drops into every 2 years, right? And like there is no way I could visit a bookmark every day if something good only showed up every 2 years. And there's no way I would remember to like check in with a channel every day if something only showed up every 2 years. And you know, we think of podcasting as this rhythmic thing, this drum beat. But for me, the most amazing thing about it is when there's someone that you follow whose work that you really enjoy, who gets busy and they disappear from your life for a year, 2 years, 5 years. And then they're like, I'm going to bring back that podcast. And back they come. And it's as if no time has gone by. And so it's not a genre particularly, right? It's a format that I find, you know, really exemplary. And one of the things that I do every day is go back through my old blog links and tweet 1-year-old, 5-year-old, 10-year-old, 15-year-old, and starting in January when I hit my 20th anniversary, 20-year-old headlines that I think are still relevant. And this morning, I teed up the tweet commemorating the anniversary of 1 year ago when the You Must Remember This podcast, which is this gorgeous Hollywood history podcast, came back from a multi-year hiatus to produce an astoundingly good 6-part series on the racial history of the Song of the South and the ride that went with it. God, I just blanked the name. Splash Mountain, which has since been, in large part because of the discourse that Karina Longworth created, it has been deprecated. They're gutting Splash Mountain and turning it into Tiana rides, in part because of this. And you know, I loved You Must Remember This when she was podcasting on the reg. I probably thought about it periodically when she disappeared, but that format, that like tickle me when there's something new format, was like transformative, like literally transformative. Like they're going to tear down and rebuild a couple of, you know, $20 million rides because of that nature of the work. Like how cool is that?
Very. You know, I think it depends on what you're looking for too. I mean, Cory brought up a bunch of great stuff and great points. I always liked how Angry Robot, I don't know if they still do this or not, but on the back of their books, they put suggested categories where this book could be shelved. It doesn't have to be shelved in science fiction. It could be put in mystery or horror or thriller or any other place. Like they always put those different things. And you're right, podcasts are like that. If you're like, I took this last week off and from work because I needed a break. And part of what I've been doing is home improvement projects, right? I've been doing the little projects around the house. So I start looking and it's like, oh, is there something out there? Is there a podcast out there that explains to me how to do X, Y, and Z? And usually you search and you find something and it's really cool. And you listen to it and it gives you some advice. If I'm looking for, you know, writerly advice, I search for that. If I'm looking for fiction, I search for that. I tend to like interviews with authors because I like to get to know authors, and it's what I do, right? That's the fun part of me for podcasting. I get to sit down with someone like Cory and ask him a bunch of questions and find out a little bit more about Cory, which then makes the listeners want to buy Cory's books, is what you hope for, right? So I like to go out and find those kinds of podcasts, anything where someone's talking to an author or an artist and just getting to know them so that I can get to know them a little bit better.
So speaking about finding podcasts, how do you find new podcasts? Do you just search for a subject? Do you go off recommendations? Is it like a mix of each, or like how are some ways you're pleasantly surprised when you discover something?
Yes.
Yes. Perfect.
I discovered the strangest podcast ever. Cory was talking about RSS. I went to Worldcon a lot. I haven't been in a while, but I went to Worldcon. I met Christopher J. Garcia, who won a Hugo Award for Best Fanzine. And then the following year won a Hugo Award for Best Dramatic Performance because of how he accepted the Hugo Award the previous year, because he just had this huge meltdown on stage. It was just all over the place. It was hilarious. And I met Chris and we kind of started talking, and I was telling him about doing podcasting. And next time I talked to him, he had started his own podcast. I said, oh, great. You know, where do I go to get it? And he's like, well, you have to send me your address and subscribe. he was recording his podcast onto cassette, and anybody who subscribed, he would mail them a cassette, and that was his podcast, which I thought was just strange and wonderful and so Chris that I mean, it blew me away. I don't know if he's still doing it or not, but that was awesome.
I'm going to make a bet that I knew why he was doing that. In addition to, he used to work at the Computer History Museum and is into this stuff. So I work part-time for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a nonprofit that defends digital rights in the 21st century. And one of the projects that we do is we have an endowed chair called the Mark Cuban Chair for Busting Stupid Patents. And Mark Cuban endowed it. And one of the first patents we busted was a bullshit podcasting patent. And it was a podcasting patent that wasn't for podcasting. It was this guy who had this weird idea in, I think, the 90s to record spoken word versions of popular science articles and mail them around on cassette. And the patent was worded so broadly that he started demanding menaces money from podcasters, and podcasters were having to send him hundreds of dollars to avoid millions of dollars in litigation. And we busted that patent. And I don't know for sure that this is what Chris was doing. I guarantee you he knew about it. And it's such an amazing tweak. It's such an amazing FU to these terrible patent trolls, because it really arguably does violate their patent, which should never have been granted, because recording an article on a cassette and putting it in the mail is not a patentable invention.
You say that now, but I mean, there are times where it could be useful.
But the criteria for patents is useful, non-obvious to a skilled practitioner in the arts, and novel, right? And as someone so Kevin here in the chat is saying, I remember exchanging cassettes by mail in the 80s. Yeah, right? The heyday of mail art was full of this stuff. But even before that, people used to send around wires, right? Recording wires and other recordings, like amateur recording trading, was already a giant thing when the Grateful Dead came along, which was certainly well before this patent was filed. So it's not novel. It is obvious. So it fails at least 2 of the 3 criteria for a patent. It is useful, I concede.
All right, well, it looks like we've got our final panelist here. Welcome, Tim. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Tim Anderson. I was 1/3 of Master Control Radio for a while. I am currently out in the middle of Kansas right now. I apologize for showing up late. And yeah, otherwise, I worked with GSS for a while. I've been a big fan and big listener of podcasts for some time. I had an improv one for a little while, and yeah.
Hi, Tim.
Hello.
Hey.
Welcome.
I feel like Tim and I have been on this podcast every year for the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of nice. I just can pull up the old notes and I've got everything I need.
Perfect. All right, I've got an audience question I'm going to throw out for a minute. Do you all prefer a podcast where they have a conversation that you can listen to passively, or do you prefer that they just stay on one topic and just have one person giving the guide?
I like a conversation. I think our conversations are organic and they can go all over the place. One of my favorite podcasts I listen to regularly is a local Denver podcast, but they've gotten pretty big. It's Beyond the Trope, and Giles and Michelle tend to have great conversations with all kinds of people, not just writers, but they just recently had on the folks from LARPs, the TV show, or the series, whatever it's called. And I just love that, you can go off on different tangents, and you don't have to, it's not a set number of questions and we're just going to get through all the questions. It's a good conversation. It flows better.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I really do prefer conversations of a group of people getting together and having kind of a gab about a subject, because things occur to people as they speak and interact off of each other that maybe they wouldn't say if they were going off a set list of questions. Although there is value in just listening to something for the information too. But I think if you want something that's more spur of the moment and spontaneous, going for a panel podcast is the best. The podcast I'm involved in, the Sci-Fi Roundtable podcast, that's what we do. We have 4 or 5 rocket scientist geeks all getting together and talking about science fiction. How I keep up with these dudes, I don't know, but I do, and it's a great It's just a lot of fun. So looking for that kind of thing, I think it would be beneficial.
Look,
To me,
obviously, sorry, you
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. Go ahead. No, please.
I was just going to say, like, I think I've kind of got some preferences both ways. Like, I like, for the most part, like when podcasters treat it like a radio show where they're discussing, where they're having fun, and like where the conversation doesn't necessarily end where it was supposed to, where it doesn't necessarily stay on topic, but you learn a lot more. That being said, like when I was with GSS, there was one webcomic who, like, I did a Q&A with the author of the webcomic and brought the stuff in, and the very style that we had, just completely derailed the Q&A, took it off topic, and the guy's webcomic that I was trying to get press for never got it because of that. So I think that there's a certain spot where you want to have each.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like anyone who appears on a there's cannot be categorically opposed to panels. So I think that there's certainly you know, I'm not gonna brief against panels. I do think that as someone who worries that he interrupts people, when you take the asynchronous nature of Zoom, and a lot of the panels I listen to are taking place over some network where it's hard to sync up and hard to get those speech cues. And then, as particularly with panelists who've been around, you know, in each other's company for a long time, who develop habits of one person habitually clobbering the other one and so on. I find that I get a little cringy. Like I get a little like, oh, come on, stop interrupting them. I want to hear what they have to say, even though the panelists seem fine with it. I mean, the edited interviews, I feel, you know, tend to elide some of that and clean it up and do well for me, I think.
Panels are hard because I used to do panels at SF Signal, and to your point, yeah, it's difficult to when people are talking over each other. It's like herding cats. It really is.
It is, and I really feel like when you've got something like that, it's probably really hard, I think, from an audience perspective, because you might be trying to get a question answered, or you might like really be trying to follow a thought and like, I want to jump on that, but someone else jumps in, takes it in an entirely other direction, and suddenly you've lost the train of thought of what you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I used to specifically call out a person, and like if this was my panel, I would say, you know, Cory, what do you think about XYZ? And then let Cory talk, and then I would jump to Wendy and say, well, Wendy, you know, do you think Cory's full of shit or sorry, do you? I'm totally used to cussing on my podcast, so I apologize. I had Chuck Wendig syndrome.
Are we not allowed to cuss on this?
I have no idea.
What is the rating of MileHiCon anyhow? Is it like PG? Is it PG-13?
I think we try to keep it PG-13
Yeah.
at least until the late night panels, but
My
I
bad.
assume anyone on the internet has heard one or two.
But I used to do that all the time and just try to call on a specific person to try to mitigate that as much as possible, so that people weren't talking over each other during the audio.
Did we freeze?
Okay.
Nope.
Oh, okay.
All right. I can hear you guys again.
Yep, I can hear everyone.
All right.
I can hear
The joys of technology.
Indeed.
So, we're talking about discussions, conversations, things. When podcasts have guests on, are there like certain people that you will follow to any podcast and give it a chance just because they're a guest?
Yeah, I think so. I'm a big fan of Brandon Sanderson, a great science fiction writer, teaches a mean world building class at BYU, which he also puts online on YouTube for free for any writer that's interested. So yeah, whenever he comes on, I try to make a point to come and hear him. I think he did a reading at Comic-Con this year. So I remember I saw him there. But I don't just listen to him. I like to listen to other A-list authors in my genre. I just find if you listen to people that have been successful doing what you want to do, hopefully some of it rubs off on you. So it's always interesting to look for that.
And Wendy, I don't know if you know this or not, but yesterday Brandon wrote a 450,000 word short story. So
wow, well, I'll have to look into that.
I got to interview him twice.
I guess for me, like I'll definitely follow like other podcasters that I like listening to different podcasts, just because I like their style, and I at least know that there's going to be one host that I agree with, but I not necessarily agree with, but one host whose style I like. But I feel like when it comes down to like famous like actors, authors, whatever else, like to some extent, I won't necessarily follow them unless someone says like this is a great example or something. Just I don't know why. There's just a certain amount of like I get more sort of starstruck with podcasters than I do with like famous actors and authors and the like.
Well, but that's your thing. You love podcasting, so you're looking for experts in the field that you enjoy. So yeah, it's nothing
makes
wrong
sense.
with that. It's great.
I find that I beg your pardon. I'm sorry. Speaking of
Uh-oh,
interesting,
Cory.
sorry about that. No. Please finish. My apologies, Wendy.
No, I'm sorry. I was just thinking what Patrick said earlier. Never mind. Please go ahead.
I was going to say that, you know, I find that if there's someone who I really like as a podcaster, they will eventually have their own podcast and I can follow it. And there are only a couple of exceptions where my podcatcher actually has an option to have a feed of episodes of podcasts that have a word in their description. So you can grab podcasts by guest if they have a sufficiently distinctive name. And there's a medievalist called Eleanor Janega, whose blog is called Going Medieval, and who does not have a podcast despite being unbelievably entertaining when dropping knowledge about medievalism. And her shtick is how medievalism and the way we think of the medieval era relates to today. And, you know, what made up fantasy stories we have about the medieval era and how they're wrong and how they were often deliberately created to be wrong, you know, for example, during the Renaissance as a way of kind of pissing on 5 centuries, and how that has turned us into people who are wrong about a lot of stuff. And I could listen to her all day, and she swears like a sailor, and it's just great.
And what are you using for a podcatcher?
I have a thing called Beyond Pod. It's just an Android app. It's a little janky, to be honest, but it has that one feature, which I don't know that I've seen in another podcatcher.
Okay.
Now that is one thing. You say that eventually everyone starts the podcast. That isn't necessarily true. The technical aspects of podcasting is a little bit above just doing a simple blog or other online activities. And I think it has been a barrier for many years for people, even if they had a great speaking voice or a great conversationalist, sometimes the technology is just a barrier to them. I know of many people who are just so afraid of starting a podcast because they just can't figure out the tech that keeps them back. So, I mean, not everybody has the radio television background, if you know what I mean. But I think it's getting better. The apps are getting easier to use. There's more access to streaming services that you can set up a video thing. I think even Canva just put in video in their graphics things for people to use for free or whatever. So yeah, there's more options today. So maybe in another couple of years, we'll see people coming forward in becoming more active with their voice and on video. But I think in the past, that has not necessarily been the case. So, but you know, everything changes and hopefully improves, right?
You're reminding me of the. Oh, I beg your pardon. Go ahead.
I'm actually going to jump in with something that's going to derail a little bit. So go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to
Go ahead.
say, Twitter started as a startup called Odeo, whose job was podcast publishing. And they had this side hustle that was short form messaging. And that's where Twitter grew out of. I had the same issue as you describe, right? This fear of the production and wanting to have high quality production from early on, and it's what actually stopped me having a podcast. And I was at a conference with Mark Pesce, who's an American Australian software developer, early VR developer, and I was discussing this, and he said, you should just do it. Just like wherever you are, whatever mic you have, just record a thing, and the people who like it will like it. And I did it for about 3 years, and literally, like, I would try to get one a week out. It would just be reading essays or short stories or eventually novels. And I would get off a plane at Heathrow, because I used to live in London, and I'd be like taking that 3-hour cab ride home. And I just recorded in the back of the cab with a built-in mic on my Mac. And it sounded terrible, but people liked it. And what ended up happening was I was at an event that I had plugged on my podcast in London, a steampunk night. And this guy came up to me and said, "Are you Cory?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I'm John Taylor Williams. I'm an American. I was in town. I listened to your podcast. I happened to hear you mention this, so I came along. This is really great. I'm a sound engineer. Your podcast makes my head hurt. I will master your podcast for you if you just want to send me the files before you're done." And over the years, John talked me into investing in a mixing board and a decent mic. And now he masters my podcast every week. And he also masters my audiobooks, and it's been a very fruitful relationship. And it makes me think that there are a lot of people right now, because of the lockdown, who are buying decent AV gear and who are becoming a little more comfortable with the process of recording themselves and so on, and that we may see a little bit of an unfurling after this, as people find themselves with AV gear and with more comfort with the medium.
But before Tim derails us, I just want to say I had a similar experience, Cory, because I bought a Mac, and the Mac came with GarageBand, and I bought a cheap little USB mic and just started recording everything in the GarageBand. And I used GarageBand for years until Murr told me I had to stop and use Amadeus Pro instead. But I recorded very simply. The very first things I ever did, I recorded in QuickTime. So I just did the QuickTime audio. But then I realized that GarageBand was part of my Mac, and I started using that, and that gave me multi-tracking and all kinds of stuff. So I think it's gotten easier.
Without descending into too much neepery, Audacity on Linux works so well, and it's such a standard, and I use it now every day, because every time I do an interview for podcast or radio or whatever, I record my end locally and send them a FLAC when it's done that I record off Audacity.
Nice.
And it's so easy to get that stuff too. Like, I mean, like, I actually wound up with some press passes at BlizzCon. And most of the stuff that I was doing there, walking around, I just did on the iPhone because it's what I had. I kept some of the stuff that I had, cut it up in Audacity later, and made something good of it.
But that's just it. A lot of people don't have even the basic editing skills to use Audacity, even though it's a free software and of excellent quality. People don't understand what digital editing is, what a different track is. All of us have done editing probably for many years, obviously. So for us, it's second nature. But for those who are just starting out, it can be a real minefield. Whoops, sorry, just lost my earplug here. Doing real good here. But it is a learning process. And I think because we've all been cooped up here for so long with the virus keeping us indoors, I think a lot of us are picking up these skills now. I mean, we have a little more time maybe, and we're getting with it. So I do know I was not doing as much podcasting before the pandemic started, but my group that I'm a panelist on, they literally told all of us that were rounding us up at the time, we decided we're going to start doing more podcasts now, because most of our people are confined at home and we can get them. And so it was much easier to assemble panels, because literally none of us could go anywhere but being in our house. And since we were all from all over the world, we have one guy from from Israel. Another guy who does the editing is in England, and all of the rest of us are scattered across America. I think we even have one Australian. But because we're all together, we've been able to just mass produce a lot of podcasts. We were doing about maybe 4 or 5 programs a week at one point before some of the lockdowns finally started to let loose. So I can't imagine we were alone. So I'm sure there's a lot more people out there that were producing the way we were.
Yeah. So speaking of time use, we've got a question from the Twitch asking, how much time on an average week do you spend listening to podcasts?
Well, I guess I'll say that I tend to listen to a lot of the ambient podcasts when I'm writing, and that could be for several hours. But otherwise, I probably only listen in short bursts of maybe a half hour, like maybe when I'm making lunch, I'll pop it into my earbuds, or if I'm going to go for a walk, I will do it that way. Because I'm an author and I work at home, I don't have a commute like a lot of people do. So the time commuting that many people use to listen to podcasts just isn't, I don't use that time. But I do like podcasts. It's part of my repertoire, and I'm glad it's there.
I've found for me, like I generally like my podcasts have changed because of the whole commute thing. And so like I'm still like I do about, I'd say like 2-3 hours a week listening to podcasts, but like before it would be like I'd be listening to them in my car, and it would be ones where people were talking back and forth about whatever topic. And I've gotten a lot more to music ones as background noise because I'm not commuting. So it's given me a chance to like, there's a Celtic music podcast that I've been following for years, and like I barely ever catch it, and I've been catching it almost every week now because of that.
Wouldn't be the Irish and Celtic music podcast, would it?
It might be, actually.
I love that. It is my favorite music podcast. God, look at this, another fan. I love it.
It's beautiful stuff. Go ahead.
Yes.
I'm leery of even putting a number on it because it's probably really high, but only because it's kind of the constant background of my life, that there's always a podcast on when I'm not talking or reading or writing. I've generally got a podcast on. And in fact, it's crowded out audiobooks in a crazy way that, you know, where I used to be a really big constant audiobook listener. And these days I live across the street from a big public pool, and I have a bad back, and I swim every day for my back. And I have an underwater MP3 player. And that's the only place I listen to audiobooks now. I get through a couple of novels a month that way, and the rest of it is all on is all podcasts all day long, all the time. Actually, what I want to ask the panelists is, do any of you cheat with like 1.25 or 1.5 or even 2x speed?
No.
I can't. I've tried that, and like every time I do, it sounds like they're chipmunks. I wind up missing points and rewinding. So like I lose time if I try to go quicker.
I have friends who do that, and they swear by it. I cannot do it. It drives me up a wall.
I don't either. I mean, especially when I listen to poetry podcasts, because poetry has a cadence and a rhythm to it. And if you speed it up, that kind of messes up the whole effect. And music doesn't sound good that way. So no, I would say I don't really do that.
I never thought of it in the context of poetry, but you're right. It's like getting in twice as much meditation by doubling the speed.
Yeah, it doesn't quite work.
I have been tempted, and every now and again I have, but for the most part, I'm a 1x speed guy. I have a friend, she's a science fiction fan, Kestrel, who's well known in the con world, who is blind, and who once let me listen to her audio interface as she was moving around on a screen, tabbing from item to item. And I was amazed by the speed and the facility that she had. And it really made me think that you could, if you applied yourself to it, take in a lot more spoken word at a much higher speed with a high degree of comprehension. And that it's just a kind of accident that we decided that our digital interfaces would operate at the same audio rate that our speech does. And there's, you know, I think a lot of our speech rhythms are set by the sender as well as the receiver, right? Like one of the reasons we listen to words at 1x is that we speak the words at 1x. but it seems like it's certainly within the realm of a high quality experience to listen to words at more than 1x if you can find a way to have them spoken to you faster than that.
All right. Well, we're
Maybe
getting
it's
down
just
to
a
our
matter of culturally getting used to it too. I don't know.
Do we have time for me to?
It's a relatively new pattern. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I was
Well,
interrupting.
no,
Sorry.
I'm just thinking that this listening at a high speed is new to our culture. We haven't quite absorbed it yet culturally. Reading used to be that kind of way. People used to read at a much slower rate, and now we speed read almost naturally because we've been taught reading at such a young age and almost universally now in our culture. So perhaps it's just a matter of audio catching up to that. Look at film. That's another good example. Cuts in film used to be a lot slower back in the day than now. Once Star Wars came out and George Lucas developed this new speed of editing, it became the new standard in our industry. So yeah, things do change, and maybe it's just audio's turn, huh?
That would make sense. That would make sense. So I guess real quick question, if just to ask on, this is sort of the rail I was going with. Do you think streaming services like Twitch are actually hurting the podcast industry? Like a lot of podcasters I know have gone more to like streaming on Twitch and like trying to be there more for like talking to their fans or playing games with their fans. Do you think that that's hurting podcasting?
No, but I'm putting on a different hat. I'm putting on my digital marketer hat because that's what I do for the day job. It's more about going to the channel where the audience is and giving them the content in the form that they want. So what you put on Twitter isn't what you put on Facebook and isn't what you put on Instagram, right? So I this is just me, coming from the digital marketing perspective, but I think that's just another channel, another medium, another way to reach an audience with your content.
I think I'd agree.
Oh, beg your pardon. Go ahead.
Oh no, I'm sorry, Cory.
No,
No, I was just saying I do agree with you, Patrick. I mean, we have new modes of distributing our work every day. I mean, we have Instagram, we have the Twitch, we have the Patreon. We have so many different ways now that weren't even available a few years ago. And the customers are having to adjust as well, not just us as the content creators. It gets to a point where there's so many different places that you can create content, you can't keep up with them. And I'm having a feeling with the audience, it's kind of getting that way too. It's almost like generational now. Certain programs or different platforms are on with certain generations as opposed to others. It's like Facebook is now for the old folks, so to speak, and the new kids are going into the Twitch and the and Discord and things like that. And they're pulling us all along grudgingly, I guess. But it's okay. The more outlets there are, the better. And I don't really see it hurting podcasts. I think there's always going to be somebody that likes to get their content that way because you have that trailing end where you can dig back for years into things and bring it up to the front. I think Cory actually was bringing that up earlier. And that's a powerful way to get your content. I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon.
I wanted to say that I think that new media's primary impact is to purify older media. That, when the silver screen comes along, you take all of the stories that had been shoehorned uncomfortably onto the stage and you liberate them from the constraint. And you also take the stories that could never have been productively put on a stage and you give birth to them. And so those new formats, I think, are great. I do think, though, that there is a movement to enclose podcasts in the sense of enclosing a commons. And that enclosure movement is centered on Spotify, but also other platforms that are moving away from RSS and MP3s and turning podcasts into proprietary app-based tools. And, the only reason to do that, well, there's two reasons to do it. One is to squeeze the audience through increased surveillance for the purposes of better ad targeting. And the other is to squeeze the suppliers, where, if you can, the modern enterprise tries to occupy the pinch in an hourglass, where on one side you have the customers and on the other side you have the suppliers, and you get to stick a little toll booth in the pinch. And so that you see this with Amazon squeezing authors on one side and publishers and squeezing readers on the other. And you see it with Uber. you know, and I think that the whole point of the Spotify acquisitions of things like Joe Rogan and the movement to these reg-walled proprietary podcasts is to erect a toll booth, to create a mechanism whereby they can exert editorial control and impose a kind of normalization over what is now a delightfully chaotic and disorganized and pluralistic medium, and turn it into something far more oligarchic.
All right. And jump in here because we're just about at our time. I want to give everyone one last shot to plug yourselves or your work and maybe one or two of your favorite podcasts that you think people should check out.
Who's first?
You can go alphabetical again and start with Cory.
Oh, okay. I'm just looking at my my favorite podcasts here to find ones that that may not be on your radar, because I don't want to just be the millionth person to say Sawbones is great, although Sawbones is really great. Trash Future is a great lefty, high-tech, dirtbag left comedy podcast from the UK that I swear by. Although it's concluded, going back and listening to the archives of John Green's The Anthropocene Reviewed, where he reviews things like cholera and chili fries on a scale of 1 to 5, is really very good. In terms of things to plug, well, there's the new Little Brother book, Attack Surface. There's the reissue this summer of the first 2 Little Brother books in an edition with an introduction by Ed Snowden. And my very first picture book, Posey the Monster Slayer, which also came out this summer from Macmillan.
I don't know how to spell. Who's next, CJ?
It's you, Patrick.
Okay. Well, in that case, since Cory keeps doing it, I'm going to bring my book cover down. This is Into the Fire. Book cover by the absolutely amazing Galen Dara, who won a Hugo Award for Best Artist. That is out and available. If you're looking for my podcast, it's functionalnerds.com. And Tracy and I put out an episode every Tuesday. And we just had Elizabeth Bear on not too long ago, which was a lot of fun. It's always nice to talk to Bear. My website is atfmb.com. That's where you can find all things from my brain. Beware, just letting you know. One of my favorites that I listen to all the time is Clark's World. I love Clark's World, and I always call Kate Baker. I tell her that she's the voice, and I just love the stuff that they do there. And then for interviews, I usually go to Beyond the Trope. So Beyond the Trope podcast, which is Giles and Michelle, and they've been around almost 10 years, I think now at this point, maybe a little bit less. I don't remember, but they've been pretty steady and doing that podcast for years. So that's always been a lot of fun for me listening to them.
All right, Tim.
Okay, so for me, I don't really have anything to plug, but I will say, like, if any of you have not listened to any of the Frog Pants sets of podcasts, I definitely recommend those. Scott Johnson is sort of the main guy behind them, and he has all sorts of different friends that he has for, like, one of them's about like video games. There's another one that's just about like the morning show, and there's one that's about politics. He's got all sorts of different topics, and just really the main thing is they're just good friends and really getting into good discussions. So I definitely recommend checking those out. Otherwise, as mentioned earlier in this panel, Irish and Celtic Music Podcast, definitely worth checking out as well.
Is Sword and Laser still Frog Pants Studio?
I don't think so. Like I think it was. I think that moved off onto its own thing.
Gotcha. Okay.
And I guess I'm last. I'm Wendy Van Camp again. My book is The Planets, a sci-fi coup poetry collection, which is nominated for an Elgin Award this year. You can find me on my blog, nowastedink.com, which is a blog for writers and readers of science fiction and fantasy. My podcast is the Sci-Fi Roundtable Podcast that you can find on Anchor. It's basically a kind of a free-for-all, a panel about tropes in science fiction and sometimes writing tips. It's a little bit of a grab bag, but if you love geeky sci-fi, we're the people for you. And if for recommendations of podcasts, I was going to recommend the Irish and Celtic Music Podcast. I had no idea there'd be another fan here, but I'll bring up another one that I like. It's called Poetry Lectures. It's a poetry reader series. It's really excellent. They have great poets. So if you're into poetry, and this is not necessarily science fiction poetry, which is what I write, but it's literary. It's just a mix of everything. And if you are interested in poetry, it is a good podcast to check out.
I've been reminded by the con to remind you that my latest books are available in the book bar with signed book plates, but that also they have a server issue. And so you have to check back later.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us for a wonderful conversation. I think we're just a little bit over time, so I'm going to let you all go. Enjoy the rest of the weekend.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for your moderation.
Yes.
And thanks for everyone who attended.
Thank you.